If you're listening to this right now, chances are you're tired. Not just physically tired, but mentally tired. Tired of noise, tired of urgency, tired of feeling like everything is moving too fast and nothing is making sense. So for the next little while, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to focus. You don't need to remember names or dates. You don't need to stay awake. Just let the words pass through you. Tonight is not about learning history the way it's usually told. It's about slipping into the spaces history left behind, the quiet places, the gaps, the moments where something existed once and then didn't. Because beneath the version of the past we're taught, there is another story, a slower one, a stranger one, a story made not of facts alone but of absences, things that vanished without explanation. Civilizations that faded without goodbye, knowledge that once shaped the world and then quietly disappeared. History, we're told, is a record of what happened. But that is quite true. History is a record of what survived. And tonight we begin with what didn't. Long before written records, before calendars and borders, human memory lived in fragile places, in voices, in rituals, in shared understanding. Knowledge was not stored in books or stone. It lived inside people. And when people disappeared, knowledge went with them. This is something we rarely stop to consider. We imagine the past as permanent, as fixed, as something carved into the world. But for most of human existence, memory was temporary. One broken chain was enough to erase entire worlds. A village destroyed by famine, a tribe scattered by drought, a language lost when the last speaker died. No fires needed, no wars, just time and silence. And this pattern appears again and again, not just in ancient prehistory but throughout recorded civilization. Moments when humanity reached forward and then stepped back. Moments when something advanced, complex, or deeply meaningful simply vanished. Not destroyed, not replaced, just forgotten. Archaeologists sometimes speak of this quietly, almost reluctantly. They find evidence that doesn't fit neatly into the timeline, a tool too advanced for its era, a structure too precise for its supposed builders, a system that appears suddenly, fully formed, and then disappears. There is no smooth line of progress. Instead, history looks more like a heartbeat, rising, falling, pausing. In some cases, knowledge appears, and then the trail goes cold. Take, for example, the earliest cities, long before the pyramids, long before Rome or Athens. There were dense, organized human settlements that functioned without kings, without written law, without obvious hierarchies. One of these places was Çatalhöyük in what is now modern Turkey. 9,000 years ago, thousands of people lived there in tightly packed homes. There were no streets. People moved across rooftops and entered their houses from above. Inside, the walls were painted, symbols repeated, animals, hands, geometric shapes. The dead were buried beneath the floors of the living. This was not a crude or accidental arrangement. It was intentional, structured, meaningful, and then it ended. The city was abandoned, no clear evidence of war, no sign of sudden destruction, no written explanation. The people simply left. And with them went whatever knowledge had held that world together. What beliefs guided them? What systems governed them? What stories did they tell themselves to make sense of life and death? We don't know. Their silence remains. This pattern repeats elsewhere. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro appeared with astonishing sophistication. They had sewage systems, standardized bricks, planned streets, public baths, but their writing system, if that's what it was, has never been decoded. Hundreds of symbols, No translations, no Rosetta Stone. When the civilization declined, the meaning of those symbols vanished with it. We can see the structure of their world, but not the thoughts inside it. It's like finding a library with all the pages blank. Sometimes the forgetting feels accidental, but sometimes it feels deliberate. History is not just shaped by time, it is shaped by power. When new rulers rise, they choose what is remembered, what is preserved, what is allowed to matter. Libraries are burned not only to destroy books, but to control memory. Languages are suppressed not because they are useless, but because they carry identity. Names are erased because names give people continuity. And when memory is broken, rebuilding the past becomes almost impossible. One of the most haunting examples of this comes from ancient technology. In 1901, divers exploring a shipwreck off the coast of Greece found something strange. At first, it looked like a lump of corroded bronze, but inside that corrosion was a machine, a complex system of gears, interlocking wheels, precise ratios. When studied closely, it became clear that this device could predict eclipses, track planetary motion, model the cycles of the heavens. It was built over 2,000 years ago. Today, we call it the Antikythera mechanism. Some describe it as the world's first computer. What's more unsettling than its existence is what followed. For more than 1,000 years after it was built, nothing like it appears again. No gradual development, no simpler versions, no descendants. The knowledge to build such a device seems to vanish completely. How does that happen? How does humanity build something so advanced and then forget how to do it? These are not isolated cases. They form a pattern, a repeating rhythm of emergence and loss. And that rhythm suggests something uncomfortable. That human knowledge is not permanent, not guaranteed, not safe from time. It suggests that what we know now could one day disappear just as completely. When we think of forgetting, we imagine chaos, collapse, violence, but forgetting is often quiet. A generation passes, a teacher dies without students, a tradition is interrupted, and suddenly something that once felt obvious becomes incomprehensible. This is how entire systems vanish, not with screams, but with silence. There is another layer to this story, one that is harder to face. Sometimes knowledge isn't just lost, it is hidden, not locked away in vaults or secret societies, but buried beneath more convenient stories, simpler stories, stories that make the past easier to manage, because complexity threatens control. A past that suggests advanced ancient knowledge or forgotten systems of equality or lost ways of organizing society, those ideas can be dangerous. It's easier to believe history moves in a straight line, that we are smarter than those who came before. That progress is inevitable, but the evidence doesn't always agree. If you listen closely to the past, it doesn't speak in certainty. It whispers, through ruins, through fragments, through questions with no answers. And those whispers suggest that we are not the first to stand on the edge of forgetting. Tonight is not about proving theories. It's not about conspiracies. It's about paying attention, about noticing the spaces where something should be and is. Because those spaces tell us as much as the facts do. They tell us that history is fragile, that memory can break, that entire ways of understanding the world can vanish without warning, and that we, too, live closer to that edge than we realize. As we move forward, we'll step into specific moments, specific places, times when the forgetting was sudden, or violent, or strangely complete. Moments when something important slipped through human hands. But for now, let this idea settle gently. There is a moment in every civilization when memory becomes fragile. It doesn't announce itself. There is no alarm, no single disaster that everyone agrees marks the beginning. Instead, it happens slowly. A story stops being told. A practice is no longer passed down. A meaning once understood becomes a ritual repeated without knowing why. At first, nothing seems lost. Life continues. Children are born, crops are planted, houses are repaired, but something subtle has changed. The connection between knowing and understanding begins to loosen. And once that bond weakens, forgetting begins its quiet work. Most of what humanity has ever known has never been written down. For tens of thousands of years, knowledge lived in the body and the voice, in songs sung during work, in gestures repeated during ceremonies, in stories told beside fires, shaped carefully so they would be remembered. This kind of knowledge was powerful, but it was also vulnerable. If a story was forgotten, it was gone forever. If a song was lost, its meaning died with it. And if a community vanished, so did everything it knew. This is why the deep past feels so distant, not because nothing happened, but because so little survived. Anthropologists have a word for this. They call it cultural collapse, not the collapse of buildings or governments, but the collapse of continuity. It happens when the thread connecting generations snaps. Sometimes it's caused by disaster, a drought that forces people to scatter, a flood that destroys sacred places, a disease that takes elders first. Sometimes it's caused by conquest, when one culture replaces another and decides what is worth remembering. And sometimes it happens for reasons we can't see at all. One of the strangest things about cultural collapse is how complete it can be. A society can exist for centuries, develop tools, build systems, understand its environment in ways that take generations to learn. And then within a handful of decades, it can all vanish, not gradually, but abruptly, leaving behind objects but no explanations. There are places on Earth where this silence feels especially heavy. Across the Pacific Ocean, on remote islands, archaeologists have found massive stone structures, platforms, statues, alignments that required planning, cooperation, and deep environmental knowledge. And yet, when Europeans arrived centuries later, the people living there often no longer knew how or why those structures were built. The knowledge had already faded. The builders were gone. What remained were stones and questions. This kind of forgetting challenges one of our most comfortable assumptions, the idea that knowledge always accumulates, that once something is learned, it stays learned. But history shows the opposite. Knowledge can disappear completely. And when it does, future generations may not even realize what they've lost. They inherit the result without the reason. Consider ancient navigation. Long before compasses or maps, humans crossed vast oceans. They read the stars, the currents, the shape of waves, the flight paths of birds. This knowledge was incredibly precise. It allowed people to travel thousands of miles across open water without instruments. And yet, in some cultures, this knowledge vanished. The descendants of skilled navigators became island-bound. The sea that once connected them became a barrier. The skills were not written down, they were lived. And once the chain broke, the ocean closed. This is the danger of embodied knowledge. It dies quietly, and when it dies, it leaves no obvious trace. Sometimes, however, forgetting leaves behind something more unsettling, something that suggests loss on a much larger scale. There are moments in history where entire regions seem to step backward at once, where tools become simpler, architecture shrinks, trade networks collapse. These periods are often labeled dark ages. But darkness does not mean emptiness, it means silence. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe entered such a period. Roads fell into disrepair, cities shrank, literacy declined, knowledge that had once been widespread became rare, complex engineering was forgotten, concrete recipes were lost, large-scale construction nearly vanished for centuries. This wasn't because people suddenly became less intelligent. It was because the systems that supported knowledge had collapsed. Without infrastructure, memory erodes. And yet, even during these times, knowledge didn't vanish everywhere. It moved. While parts of Europe forgot, other regions preserved and expanded ancient learning. In the Islamic world, scholars translated Greek texts, studied astronomy, advanced medicine, developed mathematics. Knowledge survived, just not where later historians expected it. This creates another illusion, the illusion that progress belongs to one place at one time. In reality, knowledge drifts, and sometimes it disappears from view entirely. There are also moments when forgetting seems to follow fear, when ideas are lost not because they cannot survive, but because they are no longer allowed. When beliefs change, old knowledge can become dangerous. Practices once considered sacred are labeled heretical. Methods once respected are declared forbidden. And once knowledge is forbidden, it goes underground, or it dies. This happened repeatedly throughout history. Healing traditions erased because they didn't fit official doctrine. Astronomical models suppressed because they challenged authority. Philosophies abandoned because they questioned power. Sometimes this erasure was violent, books burned, teachers killed, students silenced. Other times it was subtle, ideas were mocked, ignored, left out of the record. And when something is not recorded, it becomes invisible. What makes this especially haunting is how often the erased knowledge belonged to people without power. Women, the poor, the colonized. Their contributions rarely survived in official histories, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. This means the past we inherit is incomplete by design, not just damaged by time, but shaped by choice. When we look back, we often ask, why didn't they preserve this? Why didn't they write it down? But this question assumes stability. It assumes people knew their world was ending. Most didn't. For them, forgetting wasn't a decision, it was a consequence. Imagine living in a time when systems fail slowly, trade becomes unreliable, communication breaks down, specialists disappear. You still need to survive. So you simplify, you focus on what works now, not what might be useful later. Knowledge that requires maintenance dies first. Complex tools, abstract ideas, long-term projects. What remains is what can be carried easily, and what cannot fades. This is how civilizations shrink, not with explosions, but with narrowing focus, until only the essential remains. And sometimes even that is lost. There is a final layer to this, one that feels uncomfortably close to the present. Today, more knowledge exists than at any time in history. It is stored digitally, in servers, in systems few people understand. Much of it exists nowhere else. If those systems fail, if formats become unreadable, if context is lost, we may face a forgetting unlike anything before, not because knowledge was rare, but because it was fragile in a different way. The past teaches us this. Forgetting does not require catastrophe, only interruption. and interruptions are part of being human. As you listen, let this idea settle. That history is not a solid foundation beneath us. It is a shifting surface. And much of what once supported it has already fallen away. In the next part, we will move closer to moments when forgetting happened suddenly, when memory broke not over generations but within a single lifetime. Moments when the world people knew ended almost overnight. For now, rest here, in the space between knowing and not knowing, where history grows quiet. Most endings are loud. We imagine collapse as fire, shouting, walls coming down. We imagine panic, movement, noise. But some endings are quiet, so quiet that people living through them don't realize what's happening until long after the world they knew is already gone. History rarely prepares us for this kind of ending. And yet, one of the most profound turning points in human experience arrived not with war or conquest, but with silence. In the middle of the 6th century, something strange happened to the world. People across continents began to notice the same thing. The sun no longer looked right. It still rose, it still crossed the sky, but its light was dim, not warm, not bright, muted, as if seen through a veil. Daylight felt wrong. Chroniclers at the time struggled to describe it. In the Eastern Roman world, writers noted that the sun shone without brightness. In Western Europe, harvests failed. In Asia, snow fell during months that should have been warm. People didn't understand what they were witnessing. They had no language for global catastrophe. All they knew was that something fundamental had shifted. The world no longer behaved the way it was supposed to. Imagine waking each morning to a sky that feels unfamiliar. Imagine planting crops that never grow, animals growing thin, food becoming scarce. Imagine seasons losing their meaning. Spring arrives but nothing blooms. Summer comes but warmth never follows. This wasn't a local disaster. It was everywhere, and it lasted far longer than anyone expected. Today, historians refer to this period as one of the worst years to be alive. But for those who lived through it, it wasn't a single year. It was a slow unraveling, a prolonged uncertainty, a creeping realization that the old rules no longer applied. What made this event so devastating wasn't just hunger or cold, it was confusion. Human societies are built on patterns. Planting follows seasons. Trade follows predictable routes. Rituals align with celestial cycles. When those patterns break, meaning breaks with them, people don't just lose food, they lose confidence in their understanding of reality. For many, this darkness felt like a punishment. Some believed the gods were angry, others believed the end had come. There were no explanations, only fear, and fear spreads quickly when answers disappear. Modern science offers an explanation. Ice cores drilled from glaciers reveal spikes of volcanic material around this time. Something massive had erupted. Ash and sulfur filled the upper atmosphere. Sunlight was blocked, temperatures dropped, the planet cooled. But here is what remains unsettling. No one knows exactly where it came from. There are no clear records of a volcanic eruption large enough to explain the scale of the event. No detailed descriptions. No myths clearly tied to it. No certain location. The cause exists, but its origin is still debated. And this raises a deeper question. How does something that affects the entire planet leave so little trace in human memory? Why does an event that reshaped civilizations barely appear in common historical narratives? The answer lies not just in the event itself, but in what followed. As food shortages worsened, populations weakened, malnutrition spread, Immune systems failed, and then disease arrived. The Great Plague that followed killed millions, cities emptied, trade routes collapsed, governments weakened. The world didn't just grow darker, it grew quieter. When societies are stretched to their limits, they stop recording. Writing becomes a luxury, preservation becomes impossible, memory gives way to survival. This is how forgetting accelerates, not because people don't care, but because they can't afford to remember. Entire regions lost generations of knowledge during this time. Skills passed from parent to child were interrupted. Specialists died without apprentices. Communities fractured. And when stability eventually returned, the world that emerged was different. New powers rose. Old systems faded. The reset was complete. What's striking is how rarely this moment is taught. We speak of empires falling, of wars reshaping borders, but we rarely speak of environmental silence, of skies dimming, of the slow erasure of certainty. Yet this event likely shaped the course of history more than many famous battles. It weakened states. It accelerated migration. It created openings for new belief systems. In some ways, it prepared the ground for an entirely new world. This kind of forgetting is especially dangerous because it doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't leave monuments, it leaves absences. Think about what it means to live through a world-changing event without understanding it. No scientific framework, no global communication, no shared explanation, just rumors, fear, and the sense that reality itself has turned against you. People didn't know the sun would return to normal. They didn't know how long the cold would last. They didn't know if the world was broken forever. That uncertainty changes people. It reshapes cultures. It makes societies more inward-looking, more cautious, sometimes more desperate. And in that desperation, memory is often the first casualty. Traditions become burdens. Complex ideas feel unnecessary. What matters is food, warmth, safety. Everything else becomes optional. This is how entire eras fade, not erased by fire but buried beneath necessity. There is something deeply human about this. We like to believe that progress is inevitable, that knowledge builds steadily, that once humanity learns something, it keeps it. But events like this remind us how fragile that belief is, how easily the scaffolding of civilization can weaken, how quickly complexity can collapse into simplicity. And this fragility should feel familiar, because it hasn't disappeared. Still with us, every system we rely on assumes stability: climate, technology, supply chains, communication. When those systems are disrupted, even briefly, the effects ripple outward. The past is not warning us of catastrophe, it's reminding us of vulnerability. As the skies eventually cleared and the sun regained its strength, people rebuilt. But they rebuilt without fully remembering what had been lost. The world moved forward, but along a different path. Some knowledge returned, some didn't. And no one alive could say for certain what had vanished forever. This is the quietest kind of loss. The loss you don't notice until much later, when you realize something is missing but you don't know what it was. In the next part, we will step into a more personal silence, not a global one, but the silence that follows when a single voice is removed. When one mind, one teacher, one keeper of knowledge is erased, and with them, an entire way of understanding the world. For now, let the image remain: a dim sun, a cold summer, a world waiting for light to return. History does not always announce its turning points. Sometimes it simply grows quiet. Not all forgetting happens at the scale of empires. Sometimes history turns not because of a war or a disaster, but because one voice disappears, one mind, one teacher, one person who held something others did not. And when that person is gone, what they carried goes with them. In every age, there are individuals who act as bridges. They connect the old world to the new. They hold together ideas that might otherwise drift apart. They remember things others have already begun to forget. These people are not always rulers. They are not always famous. Sometimes they are simply present at the right moment, and that makes them dangerous. In the ancient world, knowledge was personal. It was not stored in institutions the way it is now. There were no universities as we understand them, no standardized education systems. Learning passed from teacher to student face to face. If that chain broke, the knowledge ended. Imagine a mathematician who knows methods no one else understands, a healer who has memorized generations of remedies, a philosopher who carries ideas that exist nowhere else. Now imagine that person dying suddenly. No books, no notes, no recording, just absence, and a world slightly smaller than it was before. History is filled with moments like this, but there is one that stands out, not because it was unique, but because we can still feel the shock of it echoing through time. In the early 5th century, the city of Alexandria was still one of the great centers of learning. It had been so for centuries. Scholars gathered there to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Different belief systems existed side by side, sometimes uneasily, but together. Knowledge flowed through conversation. Ideas were debated in public. The city remembered things other places had already forgotten. At the center of this world was a teacher, not a ruler, not a general, a thinker, someone known not for power but for clarity. Students traveled long distances to hear her speak. She taught in the open air, on streets, in courtyards. Her classroom was the city itself. She explained the movement of the stars, the logic of numbers, the nature of ethics and reason. But what made her truly unusual was not just her knowledge, it was her independence. She belonged fully to none of the political or religious factions fighting for control of the city, and that made her threatening. The world around her was changing. Old systems were weakening. New authorities were consolidating power. Tolerance was narrowing. In times like these, complexity becomes a liability. Nuance is dangerous, and people who embody both become targets. What happened next was not inevitable, but it was predictable. A group decided she had to be removed, not because of something she did, but because of what she represented, a way of thinking that could not be controlled, a bridge between worlds that some wanted erased. Her death was violent, but what followed was quieter. No serious investigation, no justice. The city moved on, and with her went something no one else could replace. This is how knowledge truly dies, not when libraries burn, but when living memory is destroyed. What exactly was lost with her? We can only guess. She wrote commentaries on earlier works, refining ideas that themselves are now incomplete. She likely preserved interpretations passed down through generations. She may have understood mathematical concepts that would not reappear for centuries, but because she did not leave behind a body of work that survived intact, her contributions exist mostly in fragments, mentions, second-hand accounts, ghosts. This is the cruelest form of forgetting. The kind where we know something was there but cannot fully reconstruct it. And this pattern repeats, again and again. In China, scholars were executed and books destroyed during political purges. Entire schools of thought vanished overnight. In Mesoamerica, scribes recorded centuries of knowledge in codices. Most were burned. In medieval Europe, healers were silenced, their practices labeled dangerous or forbidden. In each case, knowledge did not simply fade, it was removed. But the removal was rarely framed as destruction. It was framed as correction, purification, order. This is another uncomfortable truth about forgetting. Sometimes it is not accidental, it is chosen. People often believe that eliminating one thinker cannot change the course of history, but history suggests otherwise. Ideas do not exist in isolation. They depend on carriers. And when carriers disappear, ideas struggle to survive. Think of how much modern knowledge depends on continuity. On teachers training students, on specialists mentoring successors. Now imagine breaking that chain, once, twice, enough times. What remains is a world that feels simpler, but only because it has lost depth. After her death, Alexandria changed. The balance shifted, public debate narrowed, learning continued but under different rules. Some paths were closed, others redirected, and certain questions were no longer asked. This is how eras end, not with declarations, but with silence around certain ideas. What makes this especially haunting is that it didn't feel like loss at the time. To many, it felt like progress, like order replacing chaos, like certainty replacing doubt. But certainty is often the enemy of discovery. When we look back now, it's tempting to see her as a symbol, a martyr. But she was also something more ordinary, a person doing what humans have always done, trying to understand the world, trying to explain it clearly, trying to pass that understanding on. And her story reminds us of something essential. That knowledge is not immortal. It does not protect itself. It survives only if people choose to carry it forward. This is why the past feels uneven, why some ideas leap across centuries untouched while others vanish completely. It's not always about importance. It's about survival. There are likely countless individuals like her whose names we will never know. Teachers who lived in places that left no records. Thinkers whose ideas died quietly with them. Entire ways of seeing the world that existed once and then didn't. Some disappearances are violent, some are sudden, some leave ruins, bones, or ash, and then there are disappearances that leave almost nothing at all. No bodies, no clear ending, just a trail that fades and then stops. In the early 13th century, Europe was restless. Wars had been fought for generations. Kingdoms rose and fell. Faith was everywhere, but certainty was not. People were tired of conflict, tired of rulers who promised meaning and delivered blood, tired of waiting for something better. In times like these, hope becomes powerful and dangerous. It began quietly, not with armies, not with declarations, but with a story told by a child. He was young, a shepherd according to some accounts. He claimed that he had been visited, that a message had been given to him, not a message of war, but of purity. He said that what knights and kings had failed to achieve through violence could be accomplished through innocence. That children, uncorrupted by greed or ambition, could succeed where armies had failed. The idea spread faster than anyone expected. Children listened, and they believed, not because they were foolish, but because belief offered something the world around them did not: purpose. They gathered in small groups at first, a few here, a few there. They sang songs. They carried symbols of faith. Some were barely old enough to understand what they were leaving behind. Others were older but still young enough to feel invincible, to feel chosen, Adults tried to intervene. Some mocked them, some warned them, some tried to stop them, but the movement grew because it wasn't really about a destination. It was about escape. For many of these children, life was already harsh. Poverty, famine, uncertainty. The promise of a journey, even a dangerous one, felt like meaning. Walking towards something felt better than staying where they were. Soon they were marching across villages, through towns. People came out to watch. Some offered food, some offered blessings. Few truly understood what they were witnessing. A generation in motion. There were no maps, no supply lines, no clear plan, just the belief that something would happen when they reached the sea, that the impossible would become possible. This is where the story becomes uncertain. Accounts differ. Numbers vary wildly. Some say thousands marched. Others say far fewer, but all agree on one thing: they never came back. Some groups turned around, exhausted, hungry, disillusioned, but many continued. They reached the coast. They waited, nothing happened, and then the trail goes quiet. Later stories speak of betrayal, of ships offered by merchants, of passage promised, of children loaded onto vessels and never seen again. Some accounts claim storms sank the ships. Others suggest darker fates, slavery, exploitation. Lives erased far from home, but here is the unsettling truth. No definitive records confirm any of it. No lists of names, no official investigations, just fragments, rumors preserved in chronicles written years later, stories told by people who weren't there. This makes the event harder to grasp, not because it didn't happen, but because its ending dissolved into uncertainty. What happens when thousands of young people vanish and no one writes down what became of them? What happens when an entire movement fades without resolution? It becomes legend, and legends are easy to dismiss. For centuries, historians argued over whether this even happened. Some claimed it was exaggerated, others believed it was symbolic. A metaphor, not a march, but modern scholarship suggests something real occurred. Not exactly as later storytellers described, but real enough. Groups of children, the poor, the desperate, moving together, disappearing into the margins of history. This is forgetting at its most complete. Not just the loss of individuals, but the loss of intention. We don't know what they believed in their final days. We don't know what they felt when hope began to fade. We don't know if they realized they would not be remembered clearly. Imagine being one of them, walking for weeks, feet sore, hunger constant, still believing, still singing, and then standing at the edge of the world you were promised would open for you. And it doesn't. What happens to faith then? History doesn't tell us, because history didn't follow them, it turned away. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this. An event involving so many leaving so little trace. No graves marked, no monuments raised, no certainty preserved. And yet this story lingers, not because of its facts, but because of its feeling. The feeling of innocence moving towards something unseen. The feeling of hope unprotected. The feeling of trust misplaced. This is not just a medieval story. It is a human one. It repeats in different forms. Whenever belief outruns protection, whenever people are asked to carry meaning without support, whenever those least able to survive are sent forward first. The world these children walked into was not prepared to care for them, and the world that came after did not remember them clearly. They exist now in a kind of shadow, not fully history, not fully myth. This is another kind of forgetting, one shaped by embarrassment, by discomfort, by a story too tragic, too unresolved, too unsettling to preserve cleanly. So it fades, but the questions remain. What responsibility does a society have to those who believe most deeply in it? What happens when hope is offered without protection? And what does it mean when the past refuses to give us answers? As you listen, let this story remain unfinished, because that is how it truly exists, not with closure, but with absence. There are moments in history when the mind does not lead, when thought loosens its grip, when intention fades, when the body begins to move on its own. These moments are unsettling not because they are violent, but because they remind us how thin the line is between control and chaos, between knowing who we are and losing that certainty entirely. In the early summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg was already under strain. The previous years had not been kind. Harvests had failed. Prices had risen. Disease lingered like a shadow. People were tired, hungry, uneasy. And then, without warning, one woman stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, no reason anyone could understand. She moved alone at first. Her feet struck the stone rhythmically, her arms lifted and turned, her body swayed as if responding to something no one else could hear. At first, people laughed, then they stared, then they waited for her to stop. She didn't. Hours passed, then a full day. She continued. Her movements did not slow. Her face showed no joy, only focus, or perhaps something closer to distress. By the second day, others had joined her, not deliberately, not as a performance. They simply began, one after another, men, women, their bodies caught the same rhythm. Their movements grew frantic, and still there was no music. This is how the reports describe it: hundreds of people dancing in the streets, some for days, some until they collapsed, some until they died. The authorities were confused. They had never seen anything like this, but they did not react with fear, at least not at first. They asked doctors for advice. The doctors offered an explanation that made sense to them. They said the dancers suffered from overheated blood, a condition believed to be cured by movement. So the city did something that seems unthinkable now. They encouraged it. Stages were built. Musicians were hired. It was believed that if the dancers were allowed to exhaust themselves fully, the sickness would pass. Instead, it spread. The music fed the movement. The movement pulled in more bodies. What had begun as one woman in the street became a city-wide crisis. People danced until their feet bled, until their muscles failed, until their hearts gave out. Witnesses described screams, collapsed bodies dragged aside. Still, others danced on, and then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. There was no final moment, no cure announced, no clear explanation. The dancing simply slowed, the bodies stilled. The city returned to something resembling normal, and the records fall quiet. What happened in Strasbourg? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some say it was mass hysteria, a psychological response to extreme stress, a collective breaking point. Others suggest poisoning, a fungus growing on grain that could cause convulsions and hallucinations. But these explanations don't fit perfectly, because this wasn't random thrashing. It was rhythmic, sustained, patterned. This is what makes the event so unsettling. The dancers were not unconscious. They were aware, they suffered. Some begged for help even as their bodies continued to move. This was not pleasure, it was compulsion, and Strasbourg was not alone. Similar outbreaks occurred in other parts of Europe, not always on the same scale, but enough to suggest something broader was happening, something in the air, or perhaps something in the human condition. What happens when stress accumulates without release? When fear has nowhere to go, when belief systems fail to explain suffering, sometimes the body answers before the mind can. This kind of event reveals something important, that humans are not just rational beings. We are also biological, emotional, social. We respond to each other in ways we do not fully control, and sometimes those responses cascade. In times of crisis, people look to authority for meaning. But when authority has no answers, people look to each other. And behavior spreads, not because it makes sense, but because it feels shared. There is another layer to this story, one that is harder to measure: culture. In medieval Europe, dance was not just entertainment, it was ritual, it was spiritual. It was believed to connect the body to forces beyond the visible world. Certain saints were associated with involuntary movement. Certain feasts involved ecstatic expression. The idea that the body could be overtaken was not foreign. It was understood, even expected. This doesn't explain the event, but it shapes how it unfolded. When the first woman danced, others recognized something, not consciously, but deeply. A familiar release. And once that door opened, it was hard to close. What makes this a moment of forgetting is not the dancing itself. It is what followed. No one preserved a clear explanation. No one recorded a definitive cause. The event became a curiosity, a footnote, something strange that happened once. But what if it was more than that? What if it was a warning? The dancing plague reveals how fragile self-control can be, how easily behavior can spread, how the body can override intention when systems fail. It reminds us that knowledge is not just stored in books. It is stored in regulation, in stability, in shared meaning. When those things break down, the body remembers older responses, responses shaped by survival, ritual, and release. This is not something confined to the past. We see echoes of it today, in panic buying, in crowd behavior, in moments when fear moves faster than reason. Strasbourg eventually moved on. The dancers healed or died. The streets were cleaned. Life resumed, but the question lingered. What happened to them? The city never truly answered, and perhaps it couldn't, because some experiences resist explanation. They live at the edge of understanding, where biology meets belief, where stress meets expression. This is another kind of lost knowledge. Not a technology, not a philosophy, but an understanding of ourselves, of how we behave when pushed too far. History often remembers rulers and wars. It rarely remembers moments like this. Moments when ordinary people revealed something unsettling about human nature. As you listen, let this thought rest gently. That forgetting is not always about the past. Sometimes it's about parts of ourselves we prefer not to examine too closely. When we talk about lost knowledge, we often imagine ancient machines or forgotten sciences. But sometimes the greatest loss is perspective, ways of thinking, approaches to understanding reality that might have led humanity down very different paths. As you listen, let this settle gently. That history is not just shaped by events, it is shaped by people. And when people are removed, the shape of the future changes with them. Some civilizations fall loudly. They leave behind ruins that rise from the earth like scars, broken walls, burned cities, stories of battles retold for centuries, but some disappear quietly, so quietly that even their name begins to blur. There was once a powerful empire that stood between worlds. It controlled vast stretches of land. It governed major trade routes. It influenced politics, religion, and culture across continents. And yet today, most people have never heard of it, not because it was small, but because it vanished almost completely. Between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, across wide grasslands and winding rivers, there existed a kingdom that thrived for centuries. It sat at a crossroads. To the west were Christian lands, to the south the Islamic world, to the north and east steppe peoples and ancient trade routes. Caravans passed through its territory carrying silk, spices, metals, and ideas. Empires negotiated with it. Kings respected it. Enemies feared it. This was not a forgotten backwater, it was a center. And yet when it faded, it left behind almost nothing. No epic poems, no surviving chronicles written in its own voice, no monuments that clearly explain who its people were or what they believed, only fragments, mentions in the writings of others, echoes without a source. This is the story of the Khazars, or at least the outline of it, because even that name is uncertain. The Khazars were a nomadic people, originally from the Eurasian steppe. Over time, they settled, they formed a state, they built cities. Their capital stood near the mouth of a great river, a place where cultures mixed and languages overlapped. Merchants from distant lands described markets filled with goods from everywhere. The Khazars grew wealthy not through conquest alone, but through control. They taxed trade, they regulated movement, they understood their position. What makes them especially unusual is not their power, it is their choice. At some point during their rise, the ruling elite of the Khazar Empire adopted Judaism. Not Christianity, not Islam, Judaism. This decision puzzled everyone around them. It still puzzles historians today. Why would a steppe empire choose a faith practiced by neither of its powerful neighbors? Some believe it was political. By adopting a third option, the Khazars avoided becoming subordinate to either Christian or Islamic authorities. They remained neutral, independent, unaligned. Others believe the conversion was sincere, that the ruling class truly embraced the faith, that religious debates were held, that ideas were weighed, that a decision was made not for convenience but for belief. The truth may be somewhere in between, but what matters is this. For generations, the Khazars existed as something rare, a powerful empire that did not fit neatly into the world's dominant categories, and that made them vulnerable. As centuries passed, the balance of power shifted. Trade routes changed. New forces rose to the north. The Khazars fought wars, some they won, some they didn't. Their influence slowly weakened, and then within a relatively short span of time they were gone, not destroyed in a single decisive battle, not erased in one dramatic moment. They dissolved. Their cities were abandoned or absorbed, their people scattered, their name faded. What happened to the Khazars? This question has haunted historians for centuries. Some believe they were absorbed into neighboring populations, that they became part of Slavic, Turkic, and other groups. Others suggest they migrated, that they moved westward or southward, that they changed names, changed languages, survived quietly. There is a more controversial theory, one that has caused debate far beyond academic circles. The idea that some modern Jewish populations may descend in part from Khazar converts. This theory has been argued, rejected, revisited, and argued again. Modern genetic evidence does not strongly support it, but the fact that the question persists reveals something deeper. The Khazars left behind too little, not enough evidence to settle debates, not enough clarity to close the story. What makes this disappearance especially haunting is its completeness. They ruled for centuries. They interacted with major civilizations. And yet when they fell, no one preserved their voice. We know them only through outsiders, through Byzantine diplomats, through Arab geographers, through distant observers trying to make sense of them. But the Khazars themselves do not speak to us. This is one of the most profound forms of forgetting, when a people lose not just their land but their narrative. Imagine living in a society that knows it is surrounded by larger powers, that must constantly negotiate identity, that exists by balance, by strategy, by adaptability, and then imagine that balance breaking. What happens to identity then? Without centralized authority, without institutions to preserve memory, identity fractures. Families adapt, communities merge, languages shift. Within a few generations, a people can vanish without anyone realizing it is happening. There is no single moment to point to and say, this is when they ended, which makes it feel less like a fall and more like a fading. History struggles with fades. It prefers endings, dates, battles, declarations, but fades leave no sharp edges, only uncertainty. This is why the Khazars remain unsettling. They challenge the idea that power guarantees remembrance. They prove that even influential civilizations can slip through the cracks of memory. Their disappearance also raises an uncomfortable possibility that many other peoples may have vanished the same way, without monuments, without surviving texts, without anyone left to tell their story. When we imagine the past, we imagine a crowded stage, famous empires, well-known cultures. But the truth is far quieter. Most human societies are remembered only faintly, or not at all, and this brings us back to forgetting, not as a failure of record-keeping, but as a natural outcome of change. The Khazars adapted until there was nothing left to adapt into. They survived until survival no longer required being Khazar, and in that moment the name lost its purpose. This is not a tragedy in the traditional sense. No final scream, no burning city. Just transformation without memory. As you listen, let this settle. That identity is not permanent. That culture survives only as long as it is needed. That history does not promise remembrance, only survival. There are events so large that no single person can understand them. They do not belong to one country. They do not respect borders. They do not arrive with warning. They simply happen. And when they do, the world changes everywhere at once. For most of human history, the sky was dependable. The sun rose, the sun set. Seasons followed familiar rhythms. People planned their lives around this certainty. Planting depended on it, travel depended on it, faith depended on it. When the sky behaved, the world made sense. When it didn't, nothing did. There came a time when people across the world looked up and felt something was wrong. Not fear at first, confusion. The light was there, but it was weak. The sun no longer warmed the earth the way it should. Shadows felt different. Days felt dim, as if the world were being viewed through a thin veil. This was not local. It did not belong to one region or culture. From Europe to Asia, from the Middle East to distant lands, people noticed the same thing. The sky had changed. Crops failed, not slowly, suddenly. Seeds that should have sprouted didn't. Fields stayed bare. Trees produced little fruit. Animals grew thin. Hunger followed. But hunger was not the worst part. The worst part was uncertainty. Because no one knew why this was happening, people searched for meaning. Some believed the gods were angry. Others believed the world was ending. Some believed the sun itself was dying. There were no explanations, only stories, and stories multiply when answers are absent. This period did not last a few weeks. It lasted years. Years of strange summers, years of cold winds, years when the sky refused to behave. In some places, snow fell during months that should have been warm. In others, rain never came. Entire regions experienced famine. Communities weakened, trade slowed. Societies already under strain began to fracture. This was not a single disaster. It was a slow pressure applied everywhere at once. When people speak of collapse, they often imagine violence, but this collapse was quiet. Fields left unworked, homes abandoned, villages shrinking. As food became scarce, disease followed. Bodies weakened by hunger cannot resist illness. Plagues spread. Cities emptied. The dead outnumbered the living. What makes this moment especially unsettling is how little it is remembered. This was not a local famine. It was not a regional crisis. It affected much of the known world, and yet it rarely appears in the way we tell history. Why? Because history depends on continuity, and this moment broke it. When societies struggle to survive, they stop recording. Writing becomes secondary. Preservation becomes impossible. What remains is whatever can be remembered later, and much of this period could not be. Modern science offers clues. Ice buried deep in glaciers preserves traces of the past. Layers of ash, particles from the sky. And within those layers, scientists have found evidence of something massive. A series of eruptions. Explosions powerful enough to push material high into the atmosphere, enough to block sunlight, enough to cool the planet. But even now, the details remain unclear. Where exactly did these eruptions occur? Were there one or several? Why did no clear cultural memory survive of events so powerful? Some suggest volcanoes in the far north. Others point to tropical regions. There is no single answer, only evidence that something changed the sky. And once the sky changed, everything else followed. This moment reshaped human history. Empires weakened. Old systems failed. New powers rose in the vacuum. Belief systems shifted. People searched for meaning in new places. It is no coincidence that shortly after this period, the world entered a time of transformation. New religions spread. New political structures emerged. The old world gave way to something else. Crisis does not create new ideas, it creates space for them. This is another way forgetting happens, not through erasure, but through replacement. When survival becomes the priority, people let go of what no longer works. Old traditions, old explanations, old ways of organizing life. What replaces them may not be better, but it feels necessary. In this sense, the darkened sky did more than cause famine. It altered belief. It loosened the grip of old certainties. And once that grip weakens, memory becomes flexible. What people remembered from before the darkness no longer seemed reliable. The world had proven unpredictable, so new stories were needed. Stories that explained chaos. Stories that promised stability. Stories that made sense of suffering. This is how worldviews change, not through debate but through pressure. The sky eventually cleared. The sun returned to its familiar strength. Seasons stabilized, but the world that emerged was not the same. Too much had been lost, too much had changed. Whole generations had grown up knowing only scarcity. Their assumptions about life were different. Their priorities shifted. What they passed on reflected that. And so, even when conditions improved, forgetting continued. Because memory had already been reshaped. This is one of the most important lessons of this moment. That catastrophe does not end when conditions improve. Its effects linger in behavior, in belief, in what people choose to remember and forget. The darkened sky left no monuments, no single date to commemorate, just a subtle shift in human direction. It reminds us that history is not only written by people. Sometimes it is written by the planet itself, by forces beyond intention, beyond control. As you listen, let this idea rest, that the world we inherit is shaped not only by decisions, but by events no one chose, events that forced humanity to adapt, and in adapting to forget. Not all forgetting is accidental. Some knowledge does not fade with time. It is not lost to disaster. It does not disappear quietly. Some knowledge is pushed away, hidden, suppressed, declared unsafe. And once knowledge is seen as dangerous, forgetting becomes policy. Throughout history, there have been moments when ideas themselves were treated like weapons, not because they caused harm, but because they challenged control. In those moments, memory was no longer something to preserve. It was something to manage. When belief systems harden, flexibility becomes a threat. Questions weaken authority. Alternatives undermine certainty. And certainty, once established, does not like competition. This is why periods of consolidation are often periods of erasure. When new powers rise, they simplify the past. They decide what matters, what is allowed, what is worth remembering. Sometimes this erasure is dramatic, books burned in public squares, libraries destroyed, teachers punished. Other times it is quieter, texts quietly copied less often, ideas excluded from education, voices left out of the official record. Both are effective. One of the most striking examples of this comes not from one place, but from a pattern repeated across cultures. Whenever institutions grow strong enough to define truth, they begin to narrow it. In ancient times, many forms of knowledge existed side by side: astronomy and astrology, medicine and ritual, philosophy and spirituality. These were not separate categories. They were woven together. Understanding the body meant understanding the cosmos. Understanding nature meant understanding meaning. But as systems of authority became centralized, this blending became inconvenient. It was difficult to regulate, difficult to control. So knowledge was divided, approved forms were elevated, others were dismissed, or worse. Practices that could not be standardized were labeled dangerous. Healers who worked outside institutions were suspected. Thinkers who questioned foundations were silenced, not because they were wrong, but because they were unpredictable. This process happened slowly, over generations, and that made it difficult to notice. Each decision seemed small, a book not copied, a teacher not replaced, a tradition discouraged, but the cumulative effect was enormous. Entire branches of understanding disappeared, not because they failed, but because they no longer fit. Consider medicine. For thousands of years, healing knowledge was local. It depended on environment, on plants, on observation passed down through families. Much of this knowledge was held by women, midwives, herbalists, caretakers. Their understanding came from experience, not theory, and it worked. But when centralized institutions began to define medicine, local knowledge became competition. Uncontrolled, uncertified, and therefore suspect, healers were reclassified, not as experts, but as threats. In some places they were outlawed, in others they were mocked. In many they were simply ignored. Their knowledge faded not because it failed, but because it was pushed out of memory. This same pattern appears in philosophy. Ideas that once thrived in open debate were narrowed into doctrine. Questions once encouraged became heresy. Exploration gave way to preservation. And preservation, ironically, led to forgetting, because preserved systems resist change. They freeze understanding at a moment in time. Anything outside that frame becomes invisible. What makes this especially unsettling is that it often happened with good intentions, stability, unity, order. These are powerful motivations, but they come with a cost. When complexity is removed, resilience weakens. When diversity of thought is reduced, adaptability declines. And when adaptability declines, societies become fragile. The past contains many moments where this fragility was exposed. When systems that had suppressed alternatives faced crisis, they had nothing else to draw from, because they had already forgotten. There is another dimension to this, one that feels closer than we might like. Knowledge does not disappear evenly. It disappears where power allows it to, which means some voices are always more vulnerable than others. Women, minorities, the poor, the colonized, their knowledge is rarely institutionalized. It lives in practice, in story, in lived experience, and that makes it easier to erase. When historians later look back, they often ask, why don't we know more? But the better question is, who decided what was worth keeping? This is why the past feels incomplete, not just because time has passed, but because memory was curated. Even today, the legacy of this process remains. Some ideas are considered legitimate, others are dismissed without examination. Some histories are celebrated, others are labeled unimportant. This is forgetting disguised as judgment. When knowledge becomes dangerous, forgetting becomes a tool. There are moments when this is explicit. Authoritarian regimes banning books, educational systems rewriting curricula, languages suppressed, but more often it is subtle, funding priorities, academic gatekeeping, cultural prestige. Over time, the result is the same, a narrowing of memory, a thinning of perspective. What is lost in this process is not just information, it is possibility, ways of understanding the world that might have led somewhere else, different relationships with nature, alternative social structures, other paths humanity might have taken. And once those paths are forgotten, they are difficult to imagine again. This is perhaps the deepest loss, not what we forgot, but what forgetting prevents us from ever considering. History is full of moments when suppressed knowledge resurfaced centuries later, ancient texts rediscovered, old practices revived, but these revivals are always partial. Fragments reconstructed without full context, echoes of something once whole. This means the forgetting was never complete, but it was effective enough. As you listen, let this idea rest. That forgetting is not always the absence of memory. Sometimes it is the presence of boundaries, lines drawn around what is allowed to be known, and those lines shape the future. Sometimes the past leaves us an object that feels out of place, not broken, not unfinished, but too advanced for the story we tell ourselves about the people who made it, an object that should not exist, and yet it does. In the early 20th century, a group of divers explored a shipwreck off the coast of a small Greek island. The ship was ancient, wood long decayed, cargo scattered, statues broken and worn smooth by time. Nothing about the wreck seemed unusual until they found a lump of corroded metal. At first, it was ignored, just another piece of debris. But when it was cleaned, something strange emerged. Gears, interlocking teeth, precision. The object was small enough to hold, but complex enough to confuse experts for decades. Inside its corroded shell was a system of bronze gears arranged with careful intent. Not decorative, functional. When researchers finally understood what they were looking at, the implications were unsettling. This device could predict eclipses, track the movements of the sun and moon, model celestial cycles with astonishing accuracy. It was built over 2,000 years ago, long before clocks, long before modern engineering, and nothing like it would appear again for more than a millennium. This object is now known as the Antikythera mechanism. Some call it the world's first computer. Others call it an astronomical calculator. But whatever the name, its existence challenges a comfortable assumption. That technological progress moves in a straight line. The mechanism was not crude, it was not experimental, it was refined. The result of accumulated knowledge, which raises an uncomfortable question. If people could build this, why did they stop? The ancient world was not ignorant. It understood mathematics, astronomy, geometry. Engineers built aqueducts, machines, and structures that still stand. But the Antikythera mechanism suggests something more, a level of abstraction, a mechanical modeling of reality, and then silence. No manuals survive, no workshops recorded, no tradition continued. The knowledge required to build such a device vanished. This is not the only example. Ancient Roman concrete was stronger than many modern equivalents. It resisted seawater. It endured for millennia. And then, the recipe was lost. For centuries, no one knew how to replicate it. Greek fire, a weapon that burned on water, terrified enemies. Its formula was a closely guarded secret. When the empire that held it fell, the knowledge died with it. These are not myths. They are documented losses, technologies that worked and then disappeared. Why? Because technology does not survive on invention alone. It survives on system, training, transmission, maintenance. When those systems fail, technology becomes magic. And magic is easily forgotten. The Antikythera mechanism likely belonged to a tradition, a school of thought, a group of thinkers who understood the cosmos not just philosophically but mechanically. They believed the universe could be modeled. That motion followed patterns. That time itself could be measured. But if that tradition lost its patrons, if its teachers died without students, if its workshops closed, the knowledge would end. Not with a bang, but with a quiet gap. Imagine the last person who knew how to build such a device. Perhaps they assumed others would carry it on. Perhaps they planned to teach someone later. Perhaps they never imagined their knowledge would be unique. And then one day it was. This is how forgetting truly happens, not through failure, but through assumption. The past is full of such moments, when knowledge existed just long enough to prove it was possible, and then vanished before it could spread. This creates a strange illusion. We look back and see brilliance appearing suddenly, and then disappearing, as if humanity briefly touched something and let it go. But the truth is simpler. Knowledge requires continuity. Break the chain and it dissolves. This has happened repeatedly. In metallurgy, in navigation, in engineering, civilizations rise to impressive heights. Then conditions change, trade networks collapse, institutions fail, priorities shift. Complex knowledge becomes a burden. Simpler solutions take over. And what was once advanced becomes unnecessary until it becomes forgotten. The Antikythera mechanism did not disappear because it didn't work. It disappeared because the world no longer supported it. This should feel familiar. Even now, we rely on systems few individuals fully understand. If those systems fail, the knowledge they contain becomes inaccessible, not because it no longer exists, but because no one can reach it. This is one of the most fragile aspects of civilization. The illusion that knowledge is permanent, that once discovered, it stays discovered. History tells us otherwise. What makes artifacts like this so haunting is not just their sophistication. It is their loneliness. They stand alone. No lineage, no evolution, just a single moment of brilliance suspended in time. And this loneliness raises deeper questions. How many other devices existed that did not survive? How many ideas reached maturity and then vanished without trace? The archaeological record is incomplete. What we find is not what existed, it is what survived. And survival is selective. Wood decays, paper burns, metal corrodes, only fragments remain. The Antikythera mechanism survived by accident, buried underwater, protected from reuse, preserved by neglect. If it had remained on land, it would likely have been melted down, reused, forgotten completely. This suggests something unsettling. That much of what we know about the past depends on chance, on accidents, on what was lost where no one could reach it. As you listen, let this settle, that the past was not simpler than the present, it was different, and in some ways more advanced than we expect. The line between ancient and modern is not as clear as we like to think. Progress loops, repeats, breaks. In the next video, we will move from forgotten machines to forgotten cities, places that once thrived with life and meaning, and then vanished so completely that even their purpose became uncertain. For now, rest here, with the image of a small bronze machine, silent, precise, waiting centuries to be understood again. There are places on Earth where the ground remembers more than people do. Places where stone still stands, but the reason it was placed there is gone. We walk among these remains and give them names: ruins, sites, civilizations. But those words soften what has really happened, because these were not abstractions. They were homes. Every city begins the same way. People gather. They settle near water, near fertile land, near routes that allow movement and exchange. Over time, paths become streets, shelters become buildings, ritual becomes routine, and eventually a place becomes permanent, or so it seems. We like to imagine cities as enduring anchors of civilization, but history tells a different story. Cities are fragile. They depend on balance, food, water, climate, trade, belief. When enough of those fail at once, even the largest city can empty. Not dramatically, but quietly. There are cities we know well: Rome, Athens, Babylon. Their stories survived because someone kept telling them. But there are many others, cities just as complex, just as populated, that vanished so thoroughly they feel unreal. In the deserts of Central Asia, beneath shifting sands, lie the remains of cities that once thrived along ancient trade routes. They were centers of commerce, meeting points between worlds. Merchants passed through carrying silk, spices, ideas. Languages overlapped, cultures blended. These cities existed because movement existed. When the routes shifted, they died. The buildings remain: walls, foundations, occasional art, but the life is gone, and with it the memory of why those cities mattered. This is a recurring pattern. A city rises because it solves a problem. It sits at a crossing, controls a resource, offers protection. But problems change. Rivers move. Trade reroutes. Climate shifts. And suddenly the reason for the city's existence disappears. At first, people adapt. They try new crops, new alliances. They hold on. But eventually, staying becomes harder than leaving, so they go. What's unsettling is how complete this leaving can be. In some cases, cities are abandoned within a generation. Houses left intact, tools still where they were last used, as if people expected to return, but they never did. Archaeologists sometimes find doorways blocked intentionally, as if the last inhabitants closed the city behind them, not fleeing, not panicking, just finishing something. Why don't we know more about these moments? Because cities do not write farewell letters, And when people leave, they rarely document the act of leaving. They assume the world will remember. There are cities built with astonishing precision. Stones cut so tightly a blade cannot pass between them. Structures aligned with stars. Plazas designed for gatherings we no longer understand. Who built these? Why here? Why this way? We have theories, we always do, but theories are not memories, they are reconstructions. One of the most haunting aspects of lost cities is not their scale, it is their silence. Take cities found deep in jungles, places reclaimed by vegetation so thoroughly that for centuries no one knew they existed. When rediscovered, they feel almost imagined. Stairs swallowed by roots, walls split by trees. The forest growing through human intention. These cities did not fall to conquerors. They were not burned, they were absorbed. Nature did not destroy them, it simply waited. And again the question arises, why did people leave? Climate plays a role, long droughts, shifting rainfall, agricultural systems failing. But climate alone rarely tells the full story. Social systems matter, belief matters. When a society loses faith in its structures, cities lose meaning. If rituals no longer connect people, if leadership fails, if the future feels uncertain, staying becomes an act of hope. Leaving becomes an act of survival. What's often forgotten is that abandoning a city is not failure, it is adaptation, but adaptation does not preserve memory. When people move, they take what they can carry. Stories survive only if they remain relevant. Architecture does not travel, so cities remain behind, empty, waiting. Over centuries, their meaning erodes. Later cultures repurpose stones, rebuild on top, change names. Eventually, the original city becomes invisible. This is how entire urban worlds vanish, not through destruction, but through irrelevance. And irrelevance is one of the most powerful forces of forgetting. Consider how many cities today exist because of specific conditions, ports dependent on trade routes, towns built around resources, capitals formed by political necessity. If those conditions change, what remains? History suggests not much. The past is filled with cities that were once essential and are now empty fields, or ruins tourists walk through without knowing who lived there. What makes this more unsettling is how little time it can take. A few generations, a few shifts, and a city that took centuries to build becomes a memory no one carries. There is also something deeply human about this. We build with the assumption of permanence, but we live with impermanence. Cities feel solid, they feel stable, but they are agreements. Agreements between people and place. When those agreements break, the city ends. And when cities end quietly, they are forgotten quickly, because there is no story of defeat, no enemy to blame, no event to mark the end, just absence. This is why archaeologists often find cities that feel unfinished, as if life paused, because in a way it did. People left expecting continuity, not disappearance. The memory of these cities survived only in the ground, in foundations, in patterns, in alignments. They remind us that civilization is not a straight line. It clusters, moves, dissolves, reforms elsewhere. And with every movement, something is left behind. As you listen, let this settle, that the world we inhabit is built on layers of forgotten places, cities beneath cities, lives beneath lives. We walk on ground shaped by people we will never know, people who believed their cities would last just as we do. In the next, we will explore another kind of forgetting, not of places, but of time itself. Moments where history skips, where years vanish from the record, and no one can quite explain why. For now, rest here, among empty streets, under skies that once watched crowds pass, in cities that went missing. History is usually arranged like a road. One year follows another, events stack neatly. Causes lead to effects. That order gives us comfort. It makes the past feel stable, predictable, understandable. But there are places on that road where the markings disappear, where the path grows faint, where entire stretches of time seem to be missing. These gaps are not small. They are not a few lost days or weeks. They are years, sometimes decades, and no one can say with certainty what happened inside them. At first glance, this seems impossible. Humans record things, kings keep chronicles, monks copy manuscripts, governments track taxes, wars, and deaths. Time, we assume, leaves footprints. But that assumption relies on continuity, and continuity is more fragile than we like to believe. There are periods in history where the records thin dramatically, not because nothing happened, but because whatever happened disrupted the act of recording itself. One such period appears again and again in medieval Europe. Documents grow scarce, dates become uncertain, events blur. Later historians struggle to reconstruct sequences. They argue over timelines, over who ruled when, over whether certain years were counted correctly at all. This has led to speculation. Some believe years were miscounted. Others suggest calendars drifted. A few propose that time itself was manipulated, but the truth is less dramatic and more unsettling. When societies destabilize, they stop measuring time carefully. Calendars matter only if the future feels predictable. If you expect the harvest next year, if you expect treaties to last, if you expect continuity. When life becomes uncertain, time loses precision. Days blur together. Seasons become survival markers, not dates. Years are remembered only by what happened in them. This was the year of the Great Hunger. This was the winter the river froze. This was when the old leader died. Exact dates become unnecessary, and unnecessary things are the first to be lost. This is how time fractures, not because someone erased it, but because no one could afford to keep it intact. There are places in historical records where scribes simply stopped writing. Not for a day, not for a month, but for years. Sometimes the reason is obvious: war, plague, collapse, but sometimes there is no clear explanation, just silence. When records resume, the world has changed. Borders are different, names have shifted, customs have altered, and no one bothers to explain why, because to them the explanation was lived, not recorded. This creates a strange effect for us. Looking back, it feels as if history jumped, as if something is missing because it is. There are also moments when time seems compressed. Decades of change appear to happen suddenly. Empires fall quickly. New systems emerge fully formed. It feels impossible, unless we accept that the slow part was never written down. The past does not always unfold evenly. It stretches, it contracts, it pauses. Another reason time goes missing is because it belongs to people without power. Peasants, nomads. The poor. Their lives are rarely dated. They exist in the margins of official records. When elites fall, records fall with them, and the lives of ordinary people vanish almost entirely. Imagine a village living quietly for generations. No wars, no famous leaders, just births, deaths, work, ritual. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. So nothing is recorded. Multiply that by thousands of communities, across centuries. Entire human experiences dissolve into silence. This is not a failure of memory. It is a reflection of what was valued. History preserves disruption. It ignores stability. This means the years that feel missing may actually be the years when life continued normally. No great events, no crises, just living, but living leaves few marks. There is another, darker reason time disappears, when memory becomes inconvenient. After major transitions, new powers often reshape the past. They simplify timelines. They remove complexity. They tell clean stories. Messy years don't fit well, periods of uncertainty, times when legitimacy was unclear. So those years are compressed, reinterpreted, or glossed over, not erased, just blurred. This creates the illusion of continuity. A smooth transition from one era to the next, but smoothness is often an invention. In reality, history is jagged, and those jagged edges are where time vanishes. There are also practical reasons. Manuscripts decay, ink fades, libraries burn. Records are lost not once, but repeatedly. Every time knowledge is recopied, something is lost. Every translation shifts meaning. Every generation selects what to preserve. Eventually, gaps appear. And once a gap exists, it widens. Because future historians build on incomplete foundations. This is why debates over timelines never truly end. Why new discoveries constantly reshape what we thought we knew. Why certainty about the past is always provisional. Time is not a solid structure behind us. It is a reconstruction. This realization can feel unsettling. We want the past to be fixed, reliable, but it is. And yet this instability is also human because memory itself works this way. We remember moments, not flows. We remember beginnings and endings, not long middles. History mirrors that habit. This means the missing years are not anomalies. They are expected. They are the natural result of human attention. But when we notice them, they make us uneasy, because they remind us that the story we rely on is incomplete. There are questions we will never answer. What daily life was like during those silent years? What people believed? What small changes accumulated unseen? The past keeps its secrets not out of malice, but because no one thought to keep them. As you listen, let this idea settle. That time is not lost all at once. It thins, it frays, it fades at the edges. And that means our understanding of history is always partial, always approximate, always shaped by absence. In the next part, we will explore one of the most persistent absences of all. Not missing years, but missing people. Entire groups whose presence shaped history and whose voices were systematically removed from it. For now, rest here, in the quiet between years, in the space where time itself slips through our fingers. When we imagine the past, we often picture leaders, kings, generals, explorers, thinkers whose names appear again and again. History feels crowded with them, but this impression is misleading, because for every name we remember, there are countless others we never learned, not because they did nothing, but because no one chose to remember them. History is not a full record of humanity. It is a selective memory, and like all memory, it reflects priorities. There are entire groups of people whose presence shaped civilizations, yet whose voices are almost entirely absent from the historical record. Not lost by accident, but quietly excluded. This absence does not announce itself. It hides in plain sight, in what is not said, in who is not named, in whose perspective is missing. One of the most striking examples of this is gender. For most of history, women appear only at the edges of the story, as wives, as mothers, as symbols. Rarely as thinkers, rarely as decision makers, rarely as creators. And yet women were everywhere. They farmed, they healed, they taught. They managed households, economies, and social networks. They preserved traditions. They carried knowledge across generations. Much of what early societies knew about medicine, agriculture, and survival passed through women. But that knowledge was rarely written down. It was practiced, lived, shared quietly. When history shifted from oral tradition to written record, those who controlled writing controlled memory. And writing was power. This meant that what mattered was not what shaped daily life, but what shaped authority. Wars were recorded, laws were recorded, lineages of rulers were recorded, the rest faded. This pattern repeats across cultures, in ancient societies, in medieval ones, in early modern history. Consider craft knowledge, textiles, food preservation, herbal medicine. These were essential. Without them, societies could not function. But because they were associated with domestic life, they were deemed unworthy of record. So when historians look back, it appears as if these skills simply existed, as if they appeared from nowhere, as if no one invented them. This is forgetting disguised as normality. Another group history often overlooks is the poor, peasants, laborers, servants. They made up the majority of the population. They built cities, they worked fields, they sustained empires. But their lives were rarely documented, not because they lacked stories, but because their stories were not valued. When famine struck, records note shortages, but not individual suffering. When wars ended, treaties are preserved, but not the lives disrupted. This creates a distorted past, one where decisions seem abstract, consequences invisible. And then there are the colonized, entire cultures encountered by expanding empires, their lands taken, their systems dismantled, their histories rewritten by outsiders. What survives of their past often comes filtered through those who conquered them. Descriptions shaped by misunderstanding, by bias, by fear. Languages suppressed, beliefs dismissed, practices labeled primitive. When a culture loses its language, it loses its memory. Words carry meaning, categories, ways of seeing the world. Erase the language and entire ways of thinking disappear. This happened again and again. In the Americas, in Africa, in Asia. Communities that existed for centuries were forced into new identities, their pasts fractured, their stories broken. What remains are fragments, artifacts without context, rituals misunderstood. History books often speak of discovery, but discovery from one side is erasure from another. This is why so many indigenous histories feel incomplete, because they were interrupted, not allowed to continue on their own terms. Another group often erased is the defeated, those who lost wars, those whose beliefs fell out of favor, those whose systems were replaced. Winners write histories, losers live with silence. This does not mean the defeated vanish. They adapt, they survive, but their version of events rarely survives with them. Over time, this creates a false sense of inevitability, as if the present world was always meant to be this way, as if alternative paths never existed. But they did. They simply weren't preserved. This is why recovered voices feel so powerful. A diary found in an attic, a letter uncovered in an archive, an oral history recorded before it disappears. Suddenly, the past feels fuller, more human, more complex. These discoveries remind us that history was not made only by those in power. It was made by everyone, but not everyone was remembered. The absence of these voices has consequences. It narrows empathy. It simplifies narratives. It removes responsibility. When we forget who bore the cost of decisions, we lose the ability to judge those decisions clearly. This is not just about fairness. It is about understanding. A past without ordinary people is incomplete. A past without women is distorted. A past without the colonized is dishonest. And yet this is the past most of us inherit. This does not mean history is false. It means it is unfinished. Recovering these voices is slow work. Archives must be re-examined, assumptions questioned, silences interpreted carefully. Even then, much will never return because some stories were never recorded at all. This is one of the deepest forms of forgetting, not forgetting events, but forgetting perspectives. When we imagine the future, we often assume our present will be remembered accurately, but history suggests otherwise. What will be left out? Whose voices will fade? What parts of our lives will be deemed unimportant? The past warns us gently. Memory follows power. As you listen, let this idea settle. That history is not just about what happened, it is about who was allowed to speak. There was a time when symbols were not decoration. They were not art for art's sake. They were not designs chosen for beauty alone. They were instructions. They were memory. They were ways of carrying meaning across time, across generations, across lives. Long before most people could read words, they could read symbols. A mark on stone, a shape carved into wood, a pattern painted on a wall. These were not abstract, they were practical. They told people where they were, what mattered, and how the world worked. Today we walk past these symbols without understanding them. They appear on ancient ruins, on pottery in museums, on monuments whose purpose we no longer remember. We call them mysterious, but once they were obvious. Every culture develops symbols. They are shortcuts for meaning. Instead of explaining everything again and again, a single image can hold an entire story. A spiral might represent life and death, a circle eternity, a crossroad choice, but these meanings only survive if they are taught. When teaching stops, symbols remain, but their voices fade. This is one of the quietest forms of forgetting, not the loss of objects, but the loss of understanding. Across the ancient world, symbols were embedded everywhere, in architecture, in clothing, in tools. Buildings were aligned not just for stability, but for meaning. Doorways faced specific directions. Stones were placed in patterns tied to the sun, the moon, the stars. These choices were not decorative. They reflected beliefs about time, cycles, and humanity's place in the universe. When later cultures encountered these structures, they often copied the forms but not the reasons. The shape survived. The meaning did not. This happens again and again. A symbol outlives its explanation. Take the example of sacred geometry. Certain proportions appear repeatedly across ancient structures. Ratios that recur in temples, monuments, and cities. These ratios were not chosen randomly. They were believed to reflect harmony, balance, a correspondence between the human world and something larger. But when belief systems changed, the math remained. Builders continued to use proportions because they felt right, not because they remembered why. Eventually, the ratios became tradition, and then habit, and then coincidence. The symbol remained. The meaning dissolved. Writing systems tell a similar story. Some of the earliest scripts were not alphabets. They were symbolic. Each mark carried layers of meaning, a sound, a concept, a story. As writing evolved, efficiency replaced depth. Symbols were simplified, standardized, their earlier richness lost. What remains are fragments, marks we can pronounce but not fully understand. There are scripts today that no one can read, not because they are illegible, But because the cultural context that gave them meaning is gone, scholars can describe the shapes, catalog them, but meaning is more than translation. Meaning requires shared understanding. This is why decipherment is so difficult. You can know what a symbol says without knowing what it meant. Consider how many ancient religious symbols are now used casually, worn as jewelry, printed on clothing, displayed without context. Once these symbols carried obligations, rules, ways of living. Now they are aesthetic, detached from consequence. This does not mean modern use is wrong. It means something has shifted. The same symbol can survive while its power disappears. This loss of meaning is not accidental. It often follows cultural transition. When a new belief system replaces an old one, symbols are reinterpreted, sometimes absorbed, sometimes inverted, sometimes stripped of significance. A sacred site becomes a tourist destination. A ritual becomes folklore. A symbol becomes art. This allows continuity without understanding, which is safer, less demanding. Meaning can be heavy. It asks something of us. Decoration does not. This is why symbols are often the first thing to survive and the last thing to be understood. Archaeologists often find sites covered in symbols they cannot fully explain. They can guess. They can compare. But certainty is rare, and that uncertainty is uncomfortable because it suggests the past knew things we do not. Not necessarily facts, but relationships between humans and nature, between time and behavior, between belief and action. Symbols once guided planting and harvesting. They marked seasons, warned of danger, structured community life. When those systems collapsed, the symbols lost their function. And without function, memory fades. This is another pattern of forgetting, not destruction, not erasure, but hollowing. The outside remains. The inside empties. Modern society does this too. We inherit symbols from previous generations. Flags, logos, words, we repeat them, but often without understanding their original intent. Over time, repetition replaces meaning, and meaning becomes optional. This is not inherently bad. It is simply human, but it explains why the past feels so distant. Not because it is unreachable, but because its language has changed. Imagine trying to understand a sentence where every word remains, but their definitions have shifted. You can read it, but it doesn't quite make sense. That is what ancient symbols feel like, a sentence without a dictionary. This is why the past often feels silent. It is speaking, but we no longer know how to listen. As you listen now, let this idea settle gently. That forgetting does not always remove things. Sometimes it empties them. And when meaning is lost, it is difficult to recover, because meaning lives between people, in shared understanding. Once that shared understanding breaks, symbols become artifacts, beautiful, intriguing, but mute. There is a strange pattern that runs through human history. It does not belong to one culture. It does not depend on technology. It does not disappear with education. It returns again and again, a cycle of knowing, forgetting, and repeating. Every civilization believes it understands the mistakes of the past. We look back and say they didn't know better. We say we are wiser now. We say this time will be different, and for a while it feels true. We write laws meant to prevent old abuses. We build systems designed to avoid earlier collapses. We study history so we do not repeat it, but slowly, quietly, the memory fades. At first, the lessons are still spoken. Teachers repeat them, books preserve them, monuments remind us. But as time passes, urgency disappears. The events feel distant, abstract, unreal. The people who lived through them are gone. and with them goes the emotional weight. This is the most dangerous kind of forgetting, not the loss of facts, but the loss of feeling. History does not repeat because people forget what happened. It repeats because people forget how it felt. Pain fades faster than consequence. Fear fades faster than risk. And once fear fades, old patterns return. This is why societies dismantle safeguards they once fought to create, why warnings are dismissed as overreactions, why stability breeds complacency. The past begins to feel irrelevant. There are moments in history when people knew exactly what they were trying to avoid. They wrote it down clearly. They warned future generations explicitly. And future generations read those warnings and believed they were meant for someone else. This forgetting is not malicious. It is human. We are built to adapt to the present, to focus on what is immediate, to prioritize now over then. The longer peace lasts, the more unnecessary caution feels. The longer prosperity continues, the more fragile memory becomes. History shows this pattern clearly. After long periods of stability, institutions weaken, not from attack but from neglect. Rules become flexible, exceptions multiply, standards loosen. At first, nothing breaks. And that reinforces the belief that the rules were excessive, that the warnings were exaggerated. Then something shifts. A crisis arrives, and suddenly the old safeguards are gone. This is not unique to politics or power. It appears in every part of human life. Environmental knowledge forgotten after generations of abundance. Disaster preparation abandoned during calm decades. Social agreements eroded once they feel unnecessary. Each time the same story is told. No one expected it. No one thought it would happen again. But it always does. The most unsettling part is that history often shows us the pattern in advance. We can see it clearly when looking backward. But when we are inside it, it becomes invisible. This is because forgetting does not announce itself. It feels like progress. Letting go of old fears feels freeing. Removing limits feels empowering. Questioning old rules feels intelligent. And sometimes it is. But without memory, freedom becomes vulnerability. There is another layer to this forgetting, one that goes deeper than systems or institutions. Human beings forget not only warnings, but humility. Each generation believes it understands the world more fully than the last. Technology reinforces this belief. Information reinforces it. Control reinforces it. But understanding tools is not the same as understanding consequence. Many ancient societies believed they had mastered nature until drought came, until floods came, until the land changed. Many believed their political systems were permanent until they were. Many believed their knowledge was complete until something shattered their assumptions. The past is full of people who felt secure right before collapse. This is not a flaw of intelligence. It is a flaw of memory. When the present feels stable, the past feels irrelevant. And when the past feels irrelevant, its lessons lose power. This is why history often feels like a loop, not because humans are incapable of learning, but because learning requires remembering under comfort. Comfort is the enemy of memory. There are cultures that understood this. They built rituals specifically designed to keep memory alive. Not facts, but feeling. They reenacted disasters. They told stories of suffering. They made remembrance uncomfortable. These rituals were not pleasant, but they were effective. When those rituals faded, forgetting followed. Modern societies rely heavily on written history, books, archives, data, But memory does not live in storage alone. It lives in behavior, in habits, in what people choose to protect. When memory is reduced to information, it becomes optional. This is why repeating the past does not feel like repeating the past. It feels new, different, modern, until suddenly it feels familiar. This is the final and most difficult truth about forgetting, that even when knowledge survives, wisdom may not. Knowledge tells us what happened. Wisdom tells us what it means. History preserves knowledge unevenly, wisdom even more so. When wisdom fades, societies repeat themselves, not exactly, but closely enough to recognize the pattern too late. This is not pessimism, it is observation. The past is not a warning sign we pass once. It is a mirror we keep walking into. As you listen now, let this idea settle gently, that forgetting is not always loss. Sometimes it is choice. Sometimes it is comfort. Sometimes it is believing we no longer need to remember. And yet, remembering is the only thing that ever breaks the cycle. In the last, we will bring everything together, not with answers, not with solutions, but with perspective. What all these silences, losses, and repetitions reveal about humanity. For now, rest here, at the edge of memory, where warnings fade and the future begins to look familiar. If you've listened this far, you've moved through many kinds of silence, lost knowledge, missing years, vanished people, forgotten meanings, warnings that faded. Each one different, each one connected. Together they form something larger than a collection of mysteries. They form a pattern. History is often described as a record of humanity, but it is more accurate to say it is a record of what survived humanity. Not everything that mattered endured. Not everything that shaped lives was preserved. What remains is partial, fragmented, and deeply human. Throughout these stories, forgetting did not appear as a single force. It appeared in many forms: neglect, fear, power, change, comfort. Sometimes forgetting was violent, sometimes it was quiet, sometimes it felt necessary. This is the truth we rarely face. Forgetting is not an enemy that arrives from outside. It is something we do. We forget because remembering is heavy, because memory asks something of us: responsibility, attention, restraint. Forgetting, by contrast, feels light. When knowledge disappears, life becomes simpler. When warnings fade, choices feel freer. When the past grows distant, the present feels unconstrained. But simplicity has a cost. Freedom without memory becomes repetition. Every story you've heard here points to the same fragile center. Human beings are excellent at creating meaning, but we are not very good at protecting it. We build cities that feel permanent. Then we leave them. We develop technologies that feel irreplaceable. Then we forget how they worked. We learn lessons through suffering. Then we stop teaching them once the suffering ends. This does not make humanity foolish. It makes humanity finite. Memory requires continuity, and continuity is rare. The past did not disappear all at once. It thinned, it fractured, it slipped away where no one was watching. And yet not everything was lost. Some things survived, not because they were strongest, but because they were carried. Stories told again and again. Practices repeated daily. Ideas woven into behavior. This is the difference between stored memory and living memory. Stored memory can be lost in a fire. Living memory survives in people. This is why the most durable knowledge was not always written, it was sung, worked, performed, shared, but living memory requires care. Once people stop practicing it, it fades quickly. This is why so much vanished, not because it lacked value, but because it required attention. The past was not trying to hide from us. It simply moved faster than memory could follow. When we look at what remains, it is tempting to feel loss, to focus on what is gone, but there is another way to see it. What remains is what humanity chose again and again to carry forward, even imperfectly, even incompletely. The fact that anything survived at all is remarkable. Across collapses, migrations, disasters, and transformations, people still passed on stories, still taught children, still tried to explain the world. That impulse did not disappear. It continues now. We are part of this pattern, not outside it, not beyond it. The present feels permanent because it is immediate, but it is already becoming the past, already thinning, already selecting what will survive. What we consider unimportant today may vanish tomorrow. What we assume will be remembered may disappear quietly. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for awareness. History does not ask us to preserve everything. That would be impossible. It asks us to be conscious of what we let go. The deepest lesson of lost history is not about ancient civilizations. It is about attention. What we pay attention to becomes memory. What we neglect fades. This applies to cultures, to relationships, to values. Forgetting does not begin with erasure. It begins with indifference. The past does not demand that we carry every detail, but it does ask that we carry perspective. That progress is not guaranteed. That knowledge is fragile. That meaning requires maintenance. When we forget these things, history does not punish us. It simply repeats itself. This repetition is not exact, but it is familiar enough to recognize if we are looking. The quiet truth beneath all these stories is this: humanity is not defined by what it builds. It is defined by what it remembers. And remembering is an action, not a state. It is choosing to tell a story again, choosing to ask why something mattered, choosing to listen when the past speaks softly instead of loudly. Most of history does not shout. It whispers. It whispers through ruins, through fragments, through patterns that emerge only when we step back. And when we slow down enough to listen, the message is consistent. Nothing lasts without care. Not knowledge, not cities, not meaning. But care itself can endure. If there is one thing that has survived every collapse, every forgetting, every silence, it is the human urge to understand. Even when answers disappear, the questions return. That is why we keep digging, why we keep studying, why we keep telling stories like these, not to recover everything that was lost, but to remain connected to the idea that something mattered before us and will matter after. As you rest now, let this final thought settle gently. That history is not behind you. It is moving with you. What you notice, what you value, what you choose to remember. These things shape what survives. And long from now, when the present becomes another layer beneath the ground, what remains will not be everything, but it will be something. That something begins now, in attention, in care, in choosing not to let everything fade. For now, let the past rest. It has carried enough. And let the quiet remain, not as absence, but as space.